The biting autumn wind swept through the sprawling cemetery, rustling the golden leaves that had fallen over the ancient marble statues. Julian Ashford stood rigid in his tailored dark suit, his jaw clenched as he stared down at his father's grand mausoleum. He was the undisputed king of the Ashford Group, a ruthless corporate empire that devoured its competition without a second thought. But all his wealth, all his immense power, was hanging by a single, absurd thread. His father's final will and testament contained a bizarre clause. Julian had to marry before his 35th birthday, which was exactly 1 week away, or the controlling shares of his empire would automatically transfer to his ambitious business partner, Damien Sterling. Julian hated being manipulated from beyond the grave. He had no time for love, and he certainly had no patience for the calculating socialites who constantly threw themselves at him, eager for a piece of his fortune. As he turned to leave, intending to order his legal team to find a loophole, a soft broken sound caught his attention. He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the quiet rows of modest gravestones nearby. A few yards away, kneeling in the damp grass before a simple, unadorned headstone, was a woman. She was wrapped in a threadbare grey coat, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Julian did not do pity. He built empires. He did not offer shoulders to cry on. Yet something inexplicable drew him closer. Her fiery auburn hair caught the pale afternoon light, and when she suddenly lifted her head, sensing his presence, her tear-streaked face struck him. It wasn't just her striking natural beauty. It was the raw, untamed fury in her dark green eyes. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice trembling but laced with pure steel. "Do they charge a fee to mourn in peace now?" Julian raised an eyebrow, taken aback. Most people stammered in his presence, intimidated by his towering height and the cold aura of authority he naturally projected. "I assure you, I am merely passing through," he replied smoothly. "But you look like a woman who has lost everything." "I lost my father," she said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her knees, "and unless you have a way to bring the dead back to life, you are wasting my time and yours." Her name was Margot Ellis, though she kept the surname quiet for a reason Julian would not discover until much later. She glared at his expensive Italian leather shoes, then up at his perfectly styled hair, recognizing instantly that he belonged to a world that had always crushed people like her. Julian observed the worn edges of her coat, the exhaustion etched into her beautiful features, and a sudden wildly unconventional idea formed in his mind. "I don't have the power to resurrect the dead," Julian said, his voice dropping into a cool, calculating tone, "but I do have the power to solve every financial problem you currently face." Margot let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Ashford." He froze. "You know who I am." "Everyone knows the ruthless Julian Ashford," she replied coldly, her eyes flashing with a deeply buried resentment. "The man who buys out neighborhoods and turns them into glass towers. What could you possibly want with someone like me?" "A wife," he stated flatly. The wind seemed to stop. Margot stared at him as if he had lost his mind. He quickly explained the situation, entirely devoid of emotion. It was a business transaction. He needed a bride for 1 year to satisfy his father's will and block Damien Sterling from stealing his company. In exchange, he would pay off whatever debts were drowning her, provide her with a life of absolute luxury, and at the end of 12 months, they would divorce quietly with a massive settlement. "Why me?" she asked, her voice tight, a storm of conflicting emotions warring in her chest. "Because you clearly despise me," Julian answered, stepping closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her. "You won't fall in love with me. You won't demand my time, my affection, or my heart. We will simply exist on paper, play our parts in public, and stay out of each other's way in private." Margot looked down at her father's grave. Her family had been destroyed, bankrupted, and pushed to the edge of ruin by the aggressive tactics of a massive corporation. The irony was suffocating, yet the desperation was real. She had an eviction notice waiting for her at a crumbling apartment and a mountain of medical debt from her father's final days. But more than that, stepping into Julian Ashford's inner circle would give her access to the very world that had taken everything from her. "Draft the contract," she said quietly. meeting his piercing gaze without blinking. "But understand this, I am not a pet for you to dress up, and I will not bow to you just because you hold the checkbook." Julian felt a strange flicker of respect, completely alien to him. "We have a deal, Miss Ellis." 3 days later, they stood in the sterile, wood-paneled office of a private judge. The ceremony was as cold and transactional as a corporate merger. Margot wore a simple, elegant vintage dress she had found at a thrift store, flatly refusing the team of stylists and the absurdly expensive designer gown Julian had sent to her hotel room. Julian noticed the quiet defiance and said nothing, though his eyes lingered on the graceful curve of her neck as she signed her name on the marriage certificate. As they walked out of the judge's chambers, the heavy mahogany doors swung open, revealing Damien Sterling. Julian's business partner stood in the hallway, adjusting his silk tie with a predatory smile. Damien was a man who hid his venom behind a charming facade, and his eyes immediately locked onto Margot, scanning her from head to toe. "Well, well, Julian," Damien drawled, his tone dripping with false warmth. "You actually did it. And who is the lucky, entirely unexpected bride?" "This is Margot," Julian said, stepping slightly in front of her in a rare, instinctual gesture of protection. "My wife." Damien extended a hand, his smile never reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "A pleasure to meet the woman who saved the Ashford group at the 11th hour. We are all just dying to know where Julian found such a hidden gem." "I'm sure you are," Margot replied, keeping her hands firmly by her sides, refusing to take his hand. "But my husband and I have a celebration to attend, if you'll excuse us." Julian's breath hitched slightly at hearing her call him her husband with such effortless conviction. As he guided her toward the private elevator, he could feel Damien's eyes burning into their backs. He knew Damien wouldn't accept this defeat easily. He would dig, he would scheme, and he would look for any weakness to tear this arrangement apart. What Julian did not know was that the greatest threat to his empire might not be Damien Sterling at all, but the secrets carried by the woman standing quietly by his side. Life inside Julian Ashford's penthouse was a study in cold, calculated perfection. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, a kingdom of glass and steel that Julian ruled with an iron fist. But to Margot it felt like a magnificent cage. She had moved her few meager belongings into the massive guest suite at the end of the hall, refusing the army of maids Julian had offered to unpack for her. Their daily routine was a dance of polite avoidance, punctuated by sharp exchanges over breakfast. The first real crack in their carefully constructed armor happened on the night of the annual Ashford Charity Gala. Julian had a velvet box delivered to her room, containing a diamond necklace heavy enough to buy a small island. When she walked into the living room, dressed in a sleek but understated emerald gown, her neck was completely bare, save for a thin silver chain holding a tiny locket. Julian frowned, adjusting his cuffs as he looked at her. He asked why she was not wearing the diamonds he provided, stating that the press would expect a certain level of extravagance from his wife. Margot met his gaze without flinching. She told him that she was his wife on paper, not a mannequin to display his wealth. She said her worth was not determined by the price tag hanging around her neck, and if his associates judged him by the jewelry she wore, then his world was infinitely emptier than she had imagined. Julian was struck silent. No one ever spoke to him like that. He expected compliance, but he found himself deeply captivated by her fierce independence. For the rest of the evening, he could not take his eyes off her, watching the way she effortlessly navigated conversations, relying on her sharp wit rather than empty flattery. Later that week, the exhausting demands of keeping his empire afloat began to take their toll on Julian. Returning to the penthouse long past midnight, he collapsed onto the leather sofa in his study, pinching the bridge of his nose to ward off a blinding migraine. He did not hear Margot enter until she placed a steaming mug of dark roast coffee on the table beside him. She had noticed how he liked it, strong and black, with just a single cube of sugar. It was a tiny, silent gesture of care that completely disarmed him. For a fleeting moment as he took the cup and their fingers brushed, the invisible wall between them vanished. They sat in the quiet study, the heavy silence replaced by a comforting warmth that terrified them both, but the fragile peace was destined to shatter. The next afternoon, Julian sat at his massive oak desk, staring at a thick manila folder delivered by his private investigator. He had ordered a routine background check on Margot before the wedding, a standard procedure for someone in his position, but the results had been delayed. As he read through the pages, the blood drained from his face. Margot Ellis was the daughter of Arthur Ellis. 5 years ago, the Ashford Group had orchestrated a ruthless, hostile takeover of Ellis Manufacturing. They had gutted the company, fired the workforce, and buried Arthur Ellis in a mountain of legal debt that ultimately led to his premature death. Julian remembered seeing the final acquisition papers. He had never considered the human cost. When Margot returned to the penthouse, Julian was waiting in the grand library, the file resting open on the coffee table. The air was thick and heavy. He asked her, his voice devoid of its usual steady command, if she had known who he was from the very beginning. Margot looked at the file, then at Julian, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears and a resurfacing anger. She did not deny it. She told him that while she had not planned to run into him at the cemetery, she agreed to the marriage because she wanted access to his private records. She wanted to find the proof that the Ashford Group had illegally manipulated the stock prices to force her father into bankruptcy. She wanted justice for a man who died broken and humiliated by a corporation that treated lives like numbers on a spreadsheet. The truth hung between them, a jagged blade that cut deeply into the unexpected bond they had started to form. Julian felt a profound, sickening guilt, a sensation completely foreign to his ruthless nature. Margot retreated to her room, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence of his wealth. The days that followed were agonizing. They lived like ghosts haunting the same luxurious hallways. Margot wrapped herself in an impenetrable coldness, her silence a punishing weapon. Julian, desperate to bridge the chasm, realized that money could not fix the devastation his company had caused. He began trying to make amends through small, quiet actions. He cancelled a high-stakes negotiation in London just to ensure he was present for a dinner they ate in total silence. He noticed a rare first edition of a book she had admired in a catalogue and left it on her reading chair without a card or a word. He was trying to show her that he was not the monster his company had forced him to be. But just as the ice between them showed the slightest sign of thawing, a new storm gathered. Damien Sterling had not been idle. Obsessed with unseating Julian, Damien had hired his own fixers to dig into the mysterious new bride. During a high-profile corporate retreat, Damien cornered Margot on an empty balcony overlooking the city. With a venomous smirk, Damien whispered that he knew exactly who her father was, and more importantly, he knew about the illegal market manipulation that had ruined the Ellis family. But the twist was a knife in the dark. Damien leaned in, his voice dripping with malice, and revealed that Julian had not been the architect of that hostile takeover. It had been Damien himself, operating behind Julian's back, using Julian's blind trust to authorize the destruction of her father. And now, Damien threatened to leak Margot's true identity and her corporate espionage to the press, framing her as a criminal and voiding the marriage contract. This would finally give Damien control of the entire Ashford empire and leave Margot with absolutely nothing. Margot did not shatter under Damien's threat. The fire that had initially drawn Julian to her flared brilliantly to life. She turned away from the chilling wind of the balcony and walked straight into Julian's private office, closing the heavy oak doors firmly behind her. She laid every card on the table, telling him exactly what Damien had confessed and the ultimatum he had delivered. For a long moment, Julian sat in stunned silence. The guilt that had been slowly crushing him was replaced by a cold, surgical fury. Damien had not only destroyed an innocent family, but he had used Julian's name and authority to do it, and was now trying to use the woman Julian was falling in love with as a final pawn. They did not argue. They did not retreat into their corners. For the first time since their bizarre marriage began, they operated as a flawless, unified front. The next evening, the Ashford Group held its most crucial shareholder banquet. Damien arrived wearing a victor's smile, fully expecting Julian to announce his resignation to avoid the scandal. When Julian took the stage, the massive ballroom fell into a hushed silence. He spoke of the company's history, its triumphs, and its darkest hidden failures. Then he invited Margot to the podium. Damien's smug expression faltered as Margot stepped up to the microphone, her emerald eyes fixed directly on him. She did not speak. Instead, Julian signaled the audio technicians. The crisp, clear sound of Damien's own voice echoed through the grand ballroom. Recorded just 24 hours earlier on the balcony by the small dictaphone Margot had cleverly slipped into her clutch. The shareholders gasped as they heard Damien proudly admit to the illegal market manipulation, the unauthorized destruction of Ellis Manufacturing, and his extortion attempt against Julian's wife. Panic washed over Damien's face. He tried to run toward the exit, shouting that the audio was fabricated, but Julian's private security detail was already there, blocking the heavy brass doors. The authorities, whom Julian had contacted earlier that day with a mountain of corresponding financial evidence, stepped forward to escort Damien out of the building in handcuffs. The mighty, untouchable Damien Sterling was dragged out into the flashing cameras of the press, thoroughly broken and publicly disgraced. Later that night, the penthouse was quiet, but it was no longer a cold silence. It was the peaceful quiet of a storm that had finally passed. Julian found Margot standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city lights. He walked up softly behind her. He did not offer her expensive gifts or grand, empty promises. Instead, he offered a genuine, vulnerable apology for his willful blindness in the past. He confessed that this marriage had started as a cold contract, but she had fundamentally changed the man he was. He told her, with absolute sincerity, that he loved her, and that if she wanted to walk away with her freedom and the money, he would not stop her, but he would spend the rest of his life hoping she would stay. Margot turned to face him, the defensive walls she had built around her heart finally crumbling completely. She reached out, resting her hand against his cheek, and told him that she had stopped seeing the ruthless billionaire weeks ago. She saw the man who drank black coffee in the middle of the night, who cared for her in the quiet moments, and who had just risked his entire empire to protect her. She chose to stay, not as a contractual obligation, but as his true partner. The seasons turned, and a year later, the world of the Ashford Group looked remarkably different. Julian and Margot stood side by side in a bright, bustling new headquarters. They had officially relaunched her father's company, Ellis Manufacturing, turning it into a cornerstone of ethical development funded by Julian's wealth. As Margot cut the ribbon on the new facility, Julian looked at her with a quiet, enduring pride, knowing that the greatest deal of his life was the one he had made in a quiet cemetery. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents Julian Ashford and Margot Ellis's story as more than a romance. It shows how grief, power, class, guilt, and trust shape their relationship. Their first meeting in the cemetery matters because both arrive carrying unresolved pain. Margot is mourning her father and the destruction of her family, while Julian is confronting the control his own father still exercises through the conditions of his will. The cemetery becomes the place where two different losses meet. Margot has lost emotional and financial security, while Julian has lost the freedom to choose how he will live. The marriage contract reflects their attempt to solve painful problems through a transaction. Julian believes money can remove uncertainty, and Margot accepts because debt, housing insecurity, and her need for justice have left her with few options. Their agreement exposes class inequality. Julian's wealth allows him to treat marriage as a strategy, while Margot's vulnerability forces her to consider an arrangement she would normally reject. The story shows how money expands choices for the powerful while restricting them for people already under pressure. Their conflict comes from the defenses they have built. Julian uses control and authority to avoid vulnerability. Margot uses anger, mistrust, and independence to protect herself from humiliation. Their disagreements about jewelry, privacy, and status reveal a deeper struggle over dignity and identity. Margot refuses to become a display of Julian's wealth, and Julian learns that affection cannot be reduced to expensive gifts. Their connection grows through small acts of attention. Margot remembering how Julian drinks his coffee and Julian leaving a meaningful book for her show the beginning of trust. These gestures require care rather than power. The infographic describes their relationship as a movement from transaction to conflict, then to trust, alliance, and true partnership. The marriage becomes emotionally real only when both stop hiding their motives and fears. The truth about Ellis Manufacturing forces Julian to confront moral blindness. Although Damien organized the illegal scheme, Julian's authority and lack of oversight allowed the abuse to happen. His redemption depends on accountability, not guilt alone. He must reveal the truth, accept the damage caused under his leadership, and use his influence differently. Margot also changes. Instead of pursuing revenge in secret, she tells Julian what Damien confessed and chooses cooperation. Damien represents corporate power without ethics. He manipulates information, exploits trust, destroys livelihoods, and treats people as disposable. His exposure at the shareholder banquet highlights the conflict between public image and reality. Evidence finally breaks the protection created by status and appearances, turning hidden corruption into public justice. The reopening of Ellis Manufacturing completes the transformation. Julian and Margot do not simply defeat Damien and return to luxury. They rebuild what was destroyed and create a more responsible future. Their love becomes meaningful because it is connected to justice, accountability, and shared purpose. The infographic's central message is that healing begins when people face reality, power has value only when guided by ethics, and genuine partnership grows through truth rather than convenience.